Well, hello again, all my YouTubers, and thanks for tuning in once more to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And I hope you're enjoying my video content that I'm currently posting. And I'm sure we can all hardly wait until we can get back out there racing with our old classic dirt bikes once again. Okay, in this next video, we're going to take a look at Stephen McNally's quite nice looking KX400 Kawasaki. Now this is a bike that I filmed a few years back, but nevertheless it's still another one of those old classics from way back in the day. So I hope you enjoy this look at Stephen's race bike. So enough from me just now, and let's just jump straight into this video. Now these 75 KX400s, as I mentioned, are not that commonly used at classic and vintage race events in this modern day, and it's even rarer to actually see one in the flesh that's still being used as a weekend race bike. Now this example of Stephen's, it looks like it could be an original bike from 1975, although that rear end of the bike, as you know, it would be several inches shorter if it had the stock rear suspension fitted, as these old KXs had very limited travel at the rear end, and obviously Stephen's fitted these aftermarket shocks to improve the travel and help soak up some of the bumpy bits that he would encounter on the racetrack. Now these 75 KX400s weren't the worst bikes around for that particular year, and they were decent twin shock racers, although maybe not as good as the equivalent Maiko of the time, but when they were all set up properly and everything working as it should, then it could certainly propel the right rider to some decent results. Now this relatively slim alloy gas tank held just about over 2.5 gallons of gas, which was usually enough to keep that 400 two-stroke motor happy on even the longest race motos. Now the 400 power plant was a simple piston-ported two-stroke engine with a 5-speed gearbox and wet multi-plate clutch. Now the sparks were supplied by a modern CDI electronic ignition system, and the two-stroke oil and gas mix was fed through a 36mm Mikuni carburetor. Now as I remember, I think the bore was around the 82mm mark, and I think it had a stroke of around 76mm if my aging memory serves me correctly. Now inside the bike's airbox was a foam filter, which of course could be removed, washed and then re-oiled before being refitted and used once again. But in terms of maintenance, these were quite an easy engine to work on if you had decent tools in your workshop, and as long as you kept on top of any small problems that would occur from time to time, then this was a tough competition motor and reasonably reliable. Now even with a steel frame and a big but compact 400cc motor, these KXs were still reasonably light, and back in the day I think they tipped the scales at around the 245 pounds mark, which it wasn't really too bad for a 400 when some of the 250s of that same year were slightly heavier and certainly not as nimble to throw around compared to this old quacker. But if you put the right rider astride one of these two-stroke Kawasaki's, they could certainly hustle around the racetrack. Now the front brakes were your run-of-the-mill drum brakes, which weren't too bad stoppers for an older system, and the forks again on these 1975 KX400s were quite good for a conventional 70s suspension setup, and a rider could enjoy the delights of a huge 7 inches of travel at this front end, but as long as you weren't too ambitious with the bike and pushed them too hard, they certainly did a decent job. Of course, because Stephen's fitted these replacement rock shocks on his Kawasaki, you can see that the back of the bike is sitting at several inches way higher than it should be in standard trim, and that's because the original shocks on this bike only allowed just over a measly 5 inches of travel on the back of this bike, and these upgraded units certainly allow more travel, although they do make the back of the machine stick its backside up in the air. And as you'd expect with these underslung exhaust expansion chambers, they do suffer a lot of damage quite easily, and you can see that Stephen's pipe here has undergone some remedial surgery in the past. And as I recall, when I used to watch this bike racing, Stephen always seemed to have an ongoing battle just trying to keep this pipe bolted onto the chassis, although I think recently he's now eliminated that particular problem. Now, I'm almost sure that this is not the stock pipe for this machine, because, as I said, these low-slung expansion chambers did suffer a lot of damage from stones and other debris, and they were always being repaired or replaced, as Stephen's pipes just shown here. But these 75 KX400s would also have had a nice pair of alloy wheels originally, although Stephen's fitted these black SM Pro Platinum rims to his particular example. But I've personally seen this bike in action on the track many times, and it's a very quick bike with Stephen in the saddle, and it's taken him to many a top 3 championship finish in the past. And if you were to take a look at some of the racing videos from the Scottish Classic race events that I've posted on my channel in the past, then you can possibly catch a look at this bike in action on the racetrack. But many of the parts on these KX400s were identical to the smaller 250 of the same year, and basically the handlebars, the fuel tank, the seats, suspension, wheels and tyres, and a few other minor parts are all almost identical to both bikes, but it's just that the engine mountings on each machine are slightly different. Although these Kawasaki's certainly sold in decent numbers in the 1970s, not only here in the UK but in the US also. Okay, they were never as popular as the Honda 250 Elsinore, which sold in huge numbers around the globe, but these were still good bikes. That is, of course, if you loved your old KX Kawasaki's. Although I have to say that in the 30 odd years that I've been following motocross racing, and more specifically looking at these older bikes, I can safely say that this is one of the first examples that I've ever seen still racing on a racetrack. So either these bikes were never seen as that great in 1975, and so nobody really kept up any interest in them, or it could be that they were excellent race bikes, and the examples that are left are being kept under wraps in private collections. So I do suppose it's thanks to Stephen and of course the wonders of the internet and classic dirt bike TV that we can all still catch a glimpse of one of these KXs in its natural habitat. And although Stephen's bike's not a fully authentic original, as I keep mentioning, I think it's far more important that the bike is still used and raced so that we can all still see what these old twin shockers looked like back in the day, because there will come a time when possibly looking at these old timers through a digital platform such as YouTube will be all the evidence we have of their existence. But certainly a very nice example of a 1975 KX400, and what appears to be a quite rare item also. But again, it's thanks to Stephen for keeping the bike in use and enabling us all to browse over another long lost classic. Well, I hope you enjoyed that very brief look around Steve McNally's quite nice KX400 Kawasaki. Certainly a bike that you don't see very often these days around the racing paddocks, but it was quite good to have another look at one of those old vintage machines from back in the day. Now, coming up in my next video, we'll be scouring the video archives once again and bringing you more of those classic machines from around the paddock. And in my next video, we'll be showcasing Andy Mallock's 414 Montesa Capra, and we'll also be including in that a look at Donnie Bruce's JBR 500 Honda, and we'll also throw in a few more classics in that particular video. So I do hope you'll all return to take a look at those. Once again, thank you for your continuing support of my YouTube channel, and I hope you'll all return once more when we speak again right here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.